Greetings to you all. Greetings to you all, and welcome to the fourth policy dialogue of the Surplus Trust. And today we are in partnership with the RAW Research Advocacy Unit, with my colleague and partner in crime, Tony Rila. We are looking at helping the victims and survivors of organized violence and torture in Zimbabwe, on the back of a report that Tony will be launching shortly. We are meeting on a day, momentous day, when war has broken out in Europe, with frightening consequences. We hope that people out there will come to their senses and this doesn't develop into something that we fear might be terrible, especially for the innocent civilians in that region. So without much ado, I want to call on my colleague, Tony Rila, to take over and take us through. Tony.
Thank you very much, Ibo, and greetings everyone, and welcome to this joint policy dialogue on, as Ibo said, on a very auspicious day. A day that people characterized by war, but those of us who work in the field of mental health, characterize this as a period of organized violence and torture. Because organized violence and torture is what happens during war. And what we're here to discuss today is the consequences of organized violence and torture in times of war, in times of civil disturbance, and in times of elections. And Zimbabwe, as you know, is moving into an election next year, and many of the signs are very unpropitious, if I might say. So this dialogue is to bring together a panel of experts. It should have been moderated by Dr. Francis Dugmore, Director of the Counselling Services Unit, well experienced in the problems that victims of organized violence and torture suffer. Unfortunately, she's a medical person and she's dealing with a medical emergency. So she may join us or not. So I've stepped in as moderator. I'm not going to say very much at the beginning because I think we have a very, very experienced panel to discuss this. Firstly, the keynote presenter is Craig Hickson-Smith, who is the Director of Research and Advocacy at the Center for Victims of Torture. The Center for Victims of Torture has been in existence for, I think, more than 20 years, and was a very significant influence on the whole anti-torture movement, predominantly by convincing the United States government that what needed to be done was to create a budget line, which has to be authorized every year, for support to the victims of torture. Craig himself is well-versed in the understanding of what happens in Southern Africa. Since he was a very young man, he has been working with torture victims during the apartheid years, through the post-independence years, working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He has worked widely right across the world, dealing with victims of torture in many, many different countries, and has worked extensively in Zimbabwe itself. So he is extremely well qualified to give us a very broad overview of what happens to people when organized violence and torture takes place. He's joined by Anna Moyo, who's the director of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. CSVR, as we know it more commonly, was one of the very, very first African centers to pick up the cudgels in defense of the victims of torture. This goes way back into the apartheid years, when CSVR was a project within Wits University called the Project for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And after 1990, in a very important conference here held in Harare on the health consequences of organized violence and torture, CSVR established itself as an independent organization and has been very, very active right across the continent, a very important partner in the formation of the African Union principles now on transitional justice, and has been a very strong partner of organizations within Zimbabwe. She's joined by Olivia Mangwiro, who's a psychotherapist and psychologist working with the victims of organized violence and torture at the Counseling Service Unit. She has a wealth of experience in our country about what it means to be a victim and survivor of organized violence and torture. In the background from the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims is Asker Kirum, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is juggling two balls at the moment. He's participating. He may have time to speak, but he's juggling other things. The IRCT has been an enormous influence on the anti-torture movement right across the world. The organizations in Africa, the Tree of Life, what was the Imani Trust, the Counseling Services Unit, CSVR, the African Center for Torture Victims, right across Africa. The IRCT has been instrumental in Africa in building a robust and active anti-torture movement, specifically, as the name suggests, with an interest in rehabilitation. And in the interest in rehabilitation, they quite clearly also have a major interest in prevention, because as those of us who work in this field, we all know that prevention is 50 times more important than cure. So what one has to do in the anti-torture movement is to stop organized violence and torture. And we hope that that's what we will hear in the coming days in Eastern Europe, is that Russia and everybody else will work out that there are better ways to solve this problem than by creating vast numbers of victims. So without that, I would really like to invite Craig Hickson-Smith to join us and to give us his thoughts about organized violence and torture and what we need to do to assist the victims of organized violence and torture. Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and hello to everyone. It's an enormous privilege to have this opportunity to support the release of this new report. I was reflecting as I was preparing for this talk of how many of these reports I have read over the years. And I say that by no means to diminish the report, but to say how important it is that we keep on doing the work of documenting the impact of organized violence and torture, that we keep on publishing, that we keep on using every means we have available to draw public attention, to draw the attention of policymakers, to draw the attention of the state to the harm that is perpetrated through organized violence and torture. And so over time, there's this development of a weight of documentation of harm that is necessary for a country to move beyond that harm and to progress and to grow and to become more peaceful and to become healthier. And so this report is one more piece of that growing weight of evidence calling attention to the work that we all do and the work that we all need to do going into the future. It's also a great privilege to see in the introduction to the report so much of the stuff that I've been involved with over the years, the various organizations that we've built to do this work. And as Tony said, I won't repeat his comments, but the work of CSVR, the work of Sinani in KwaZulu-Natal, which I was involved in, the work of the Amani Trust, the work of IRCT, the work of Tree of Life, and many, many other organizations besides. All of that continuous building and work and all the struggles and all the difficulties that we've been through, it really gave me pause to sort of slow down and reflect on both how hard this work is and how much I have got out of it and how much I appreciate all the people that I've worked with in this work. So with those brief introductory comments, I'm going to start hopefully sharing my screen. I have prepared some slides to help me along here. And so
you're up and we can see.
Great, thank you, Tony. So I've stolen the title of the report. I thought I would just save myself the trouble of being creative and thinking of something for myself. So I stole the title. And the first point I want to make is really to go back to some of the basics and think about what is the character of organized violence and torture. And I'm very aware that I'm preaching to the choir, as we say, or that everyone on the call with us today really has deep experience of this. But I think sometimes we forget, and it's worth just kind of going back to the basics and remembering that these are crimes that are premeditated and calculating. They are crimes that are intimately connected to the victim's beliefs, to their behaviors in the world, or to aspects of their identity. Very commonly, organized violence and torture is prolonged, or it's repeated, or it's ongoing. People are in many ways trapped in ongoing cycles of harassment, intimidation, detention, war. The perpetrators tend to have tremendous power, and that makes organized violence and torture either literally inescapable or it makes it feel inescapable. And on top of all of this, very commonly victims are stigmatized, blamed, and isolated from the support structures that they would normally use to heal and recover. And so when we speak about organized violence and torture, we're talking about a very particular set of crimes that produce a very particular set of harms and a very particular kind of damage on the psyche of individuals, on families, on communities, and on society as a whole. And that's certainly a theme I want to emphasize. The report speaks a great deal about the high prevalence rates of common mental disorders in Zimbabwe. And many of those studies are shocking, that the rates of common mental disorders are as high as they are in certain parts of the populations at certain times during the history of the country. And the report does a really good job of documenting all the studies that have been done over time, looking at common mental disorders. But for me, those mental disorders are not the problem. What they are is a bright flashing neon sign that points us at the problem. These studies are incredibly important because measuring common mental disorders is something we know how to do. And we know how to do it fairly well, and we know what a healthy society looks like. These disorders are present in every society, but when a society is systematically victimized through organized violence over decades, we see a very particular pattern. We see a change in the prevalence rates of many of these disorders, to the point where the majority of people within the society are suffering at some level. And so for me, bringing attention to the prevalence rates is a fundamental way of drawing a real clear line in the sand to say, look, this is the harm. We can see the harm. We can document the harm. This comes from somewhere. And that's why we have to keep on asking the questions around what are the prevalence rates around common mental health disorders that are associated with suffering violence. And so, one of the core recommendations to come out of the report is a prevalence study to really look at, what is the situation of the Zimbabwean population. All of us on this call know what the answer is. We know the answer is horrible, but we need the data, we need the evidence. And that goes back to my theme of constantly building on our evidence base. But as I say, the mental health disorders themselves are not the problem. They're a sign of the problem. So then how do we think about what the problem is? And for this, I go to ecological models always. An ecological model is a model that places the individual at the center, but then recognizes that that individual exists within relationship with many other people, families, colleagues at work, school friends, peers. And then those interpersonal networks exist within communities. Communities might be geographically defined, or they might be defined in other kinds of ways. For example, a community of mental health practitioners is another kind of community. And then all of those communities exist within society at large. And I think that when you look at the work of organized violence and torture, and it is work, it's intentional work designed to victimize people and networks and organizations and families. When you look at that work, it's really about achieving two things: fragmentation and silencing. So let me give a couple of examples at different levels to illustrate that a little bit. If we think about individual human beings, one of the things that violence does, and one of the things that trauma does, is it breaks apart our memory. It breaks apart the narrative of our experience of ourselves. And so our memories become fragmented. Equally, one of the ways of thinking about trauma is that trauma is literally the unspeakable. There is neurological evidence that shows that parts of our brain, a part of our brain called Broca's region, which is directly connected to our ability to communicate and speak, is incapacitated when we are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. And so in a very fundamental neurological way, trauma actually silences us. I've spent lots of time face to face with victims of awful violence. And so many people say, I have no words to explain what this feels like. And that's literally true. They do not have the words. And so the trauma silences people. If we think about it at an interpersonal level, think about the families who have suffered in past generations terrible violence, or perhaps have been involved in perpetrating terrible violence, and how those secrets are held within families. Parents and grandparents wonder whether they can share the truth of what they have been through with the next generation. And when they don't share, when there's this hidden story, this family secret that the youngest generation knows about but knows nothing about, there starts to be a fragmentation in the family. There starts to be a breakdown in trust. And so again, we see the silencing and the fragmentation within families. At a community level, think about the school teacher who wants to teach history, who wants to teach the history of Zimbabwe honestly, but is afraid about what will happen if she talks about her experience of the history of her community, of her country. There's a silencing, there's a loss of learning, there's a loss of history. And you think about the divided communities, the loss of trust within communities, the fragmentation that has happened within communities. And then as we head right out to the society level, I can't help thinking about the enormous Zimbabwe diaspora, many of whom are in South Africa, many of whom are in the United States, where I also work. And thinking about the terrible kind of situation they're in, where they so badly want to support their families and communities back home, and do that by sending money, but in so doing, helplessly continue to support a failing state, and a state that has subjected its citizens to organized violence for decades now. I think also of the distrust of the state, the inability to maintain law and order, the inability to have trust in courts and court decisions, the inability of the press to do their work as a free press. All of these are ways in which society as a whole is fragmented, and the agencies that make society work are silenced. And so I really reject a medicalized understanding of the impact of organized violence and torture. I think it is fundamentally a political problem. And I use political in the broadest sense of the word there, that it engages all of society, all of the mechanisms and the machinery of society. And so if I understand the impacts of organized violence and torture through this lens of fragmentation and silencing, well, then what do I have to offer in terms of what is healing, what does helping look like? And for me, it's the opposite. It's that all of our work is organized around these fundamental principles of building solidarity and building agency. And there are many, many ways of doing that. And I'm going to leave some space for us all to think about and talk about many of the ways that that is already happening in Zimbabwe. Throughout this history, civil society organizations, faith-based organizations in Zimbabwe have picked up the work of protecting people and of caring for people, of bringing people together, of creating unity. And many of the people responsible for that work are on this call. So it's not my place to speak about that. I want to just highlight these two core principles. I also want to speak a little bit about layering. I think this is fundamentally important. And certainly as I've got older, I've been doing this work for more than 30 years now. I've started to understand the layers and to understand the importance of layering. And I've started to think about how the history of organized violence and torture is one layer upon another layer upon another layer of violence that sits in the histories of our societies, in Zimbabwe society, in South African society, all around the world. And as I think about what's happening in Europe at the moment, I think about the next layer that is being laid down of suffering and hardship, and how at each point along the way, we construct and we reconstruct the narratives of organized violence and torture. And you know, in Zimbabwe, there are many landmarks. There's the second Chimurenga, there's Gokurahundi, there's the election violence 10 or 12 years ago, there's Murambatsina. There are all these landmarks that we have in our memories. But then, of course, those are just the things that have stood out and been named. But all along the way, if you look at the community level, if you look at family level, there have been these layers and layers and layers of violence. And we have to recognize that. We have to recognize the intergenerational impact. And we have to look at the ways trauma is carried from the past forward into the present and into the future. And many individuals and organizations and networks have a special role in the way they carry trauma forwards. And most of the time, we do that with the intention of healing and the intention of memorializing and remembering the past, and with a hope to preventing similar things happening in the future and building a better society. But we also need to recognize that trauma can be carried forward in ways that are not healing. There are people in South Africa today who will bring up the Anglo-Boer War with the intention of creating political power and building political power and building division between English and Afrikaans-speaking white people in South Africa. There are people who deny the Holocaust, and they do so today, carrying trauma forward in a way that is, in the end, I believe, damaging to our society and damaging to our future. So we have to think about how trauma is carried forwards. So if we are working with this layering, we have to think about how we do the work of creating a shared narrative within society and within our communities. A common understanding of what we have been through and how that defines us now and into the future. In order to achieve that, we need safety, we need transparency. And we have to do the work of excavation and documentation. So as I think of these layers, I think of a kind of archaeological dig. And I realize that sometimes I'm talking about a literal archaeological dig, where we are opening graves from the past in order to find the truth. But we have to do that work. We have to do the excavation work. We have to go back through the layers, and we have to document at each point along the way. One of the things that we really suffered from in the Truth Commission in South Africa is that during the apartheid years, we hadn't done enough documentation. We didn't have enough evidence of the atrocities that had been committed under apartheid. And so we were limited in the extent to which we could hold the perpetrators of those atrocities accountable as we transitioned into the South Africa we have today. That process of excavation and documentation is fundamental. And then we have the work of truth-telling and memorialization. The National Peace and Reconciliation Commission in Zimbabwe, as with the South African Truth and Reconciliation, has flaws and is open to criticism, and I've been very vocal in my criticism of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how it failed victims. But at the same time, it also started the process of creating that shared national dialogue, that shared national and narrative of what has happened to us in the past and what it means for our future. And it creates space for the other levels. It creates space for the community archives and the community histories, for the family histories and the individual histories. And so all of those levels are really important. And then I want to speak a little bit about roles. I'm going to pull out 4 roles here: the role of victim and survivor, the role of bystanders, those of us who have stood by and watched atrocities happen, the role of the advocates and the helpers, and of course the role of perpetrators. And it's fundamental to recognize that at different times and in different situations, most of us have been in all of these different roles in some way or other. We have to recognize that we are all part of this emerging picture, and that we're all harmed, and that we all have a role in stopping future harm, or if we make bad choices, perpetrating it or perpetuating it. But for me, it's really important that we change this picture and we make the picture look something like this. And that is that as we work, as a third principle, we constantly work on centering the experience and the needs and the risks taken by victims and survivors. So it's the people who are in that role when we consider any particular event or atrocity that we have to foreground. And that's not what generally happens. In fact, very often, the victims and the survivors are in the background, and they are the people who are forgotten, even though they carry more than any of us the harm and the hurt perpetrated by the atrocity. So it's easy to say, how do we center victims? What is victim-centered transitional justice? What does victim-centered healing look like? I don't claim to have all the answers at all, but I can tell you some of the things that I've tried and we're trying in the Center for Victims of Torture. One of the things we've done is to start our work by asking questions. And 2 of the fundamental questions that we've been asking victims are, what does healing mean for you? And what does justice mean for you? And the answers are not always what the people around on this meeting would expect. I have been surprised repeatedly by the answers I get when I ask people these questions seriously, and when I put aside my assumptions and my prejudices and really listen. And one of the things that happens is this enormous pressure that everyone needs healing and everybody deserves a kind of legal justice is relieved, because lots of victims are not asking for psychotherapy, and they're not asking for reparations and to be the center of a court case where the person who hurt their family or hurt them goes to prison for life, or they're not asking for a huge amount of money. They're asking for things that are actually achievable and realistic and possible within our transitioning societies, especially in the global South, where there aren't the resources to give people what is envisaged, for example, in the Convention Against Torture when we speak about reparation. There are just too many victims. It's just becomes an overwhelming problem. But when we actually ask about what people mean when they talk about healing and justice, we get answers that actually are reasonable and realistic given our society's resources. Another part of centering victims is about giving people real choices. So in one of our programs, we have several pathways which the victims we work with can choose to engage. For example, they can choose that their path to healing for themselves and their path to justice involves work on public awareness raising. And then what we do is we facilitate their work either within their country or internationally to raise awareness on what has happened in their community and to them as populations. And so we're focusing on that, giving people voice, on giving people agency, creating platforms whereby victims of organized violence and torture can broadcast their message more effectively. Another choice is to engage in creative writing as a healing and a process of healing and acquiring justice. And that might be telling your story in a way that's just for you and your family, or it might be putting your story on the internet or getting your story out there into newspapers and other platforms. Or we create ways in which victims can become involved in policy work, in community organizing and policy engagement around whatever the issues are that are affecting their community. And so again, it's around organizing, connecting, building solidarity and giving agency or facilitating agency. You can never give agency. One of the avenues we invite people into is to help us with research. Unfortunately for me, as Director of Evaluation and Research, I don't get a lot of takers. Most people want to go in other directions, but it's there. It's a possibility of helping us learn how to do the work of healing individuals, families, and society better. And then finally, there is the one we most often think about, and that is the journey of legal accountability. And as we think about all of these kind of options, we have to have real conversations about risk. We have to talk about what does this mean for the survivors and the victims who put themselves forward. And sometimes, you know, those conversations are hard. The implications for family, the implications for many, many years of life in long legal battles, the implications of having your story out there in the world in a way that you can never take it back are real implications that we have to discuss with in a realistic way with survivors and victims. We have to build systems of continuous consent, and we have to create feedback loops so that people remain engaged with the ongoing work of healing and justice in their societies. And so with that, I think I've overdone my time, and I'm going to just say thank you all for listening to my thoughts on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and engage with you in a conversation. I'd love for you to get in touch with me. There's my email address on the screen. Thank you all for your attention.
Craig, that was extremely rich. I know that that's an immensely long digestion of basically a lifetime's work, actually. I mean, you started this work, I think, when you were actually quite a young man. And I think that's a very important distillation of that. One question before I go to ask you, and that is that your experience has taken you to multiple places. I mean, I know you've worked in the Middle East, I know you've worked in Latin America, I know you've worked all over the place. I'm presuming that these observations you have are generalities or commonalities that you've seen in all these different places. I mean, the distillation about the fragmentation, for example, and that effect on societies, and then the corollary of that, which is the notion of solidarity and agency. I mean, maybe you could say a little bit about the spread of this internationally in your experience.
Oh, Tony, I mean, thank you for that question. Yes, these are really deep, broad constructs. And I think they have to have the kind of universal generality that I am working with as in my role, and that I think we need as a society and as a world. And so, you know, I compare my work in El Salvador El Salvador, Latin American countries have much in common with Southern African countries in terms of the liberation movements having a really deep political analysis and political richness and a deep understanding of the fundamental importance of solidarity. And so my work in El Salvador, really, when I started to talk about solidarity, people already knew it all. They already had the networks. They already understood the dangers of infiltration. It's part of the DNA of how many Latin American countries and civil society in many Latin American countries works and operates. And in many ways, work in Latin America is the most resonant for me of work in Southern Africa. When I compare that to work in the Middle East, and I'm going to use Egypt as an example, civil society in Egypt at the moment is so divided. There is so much suspicion between different organizations, between different networks, that just finding a solid meeting point for people who are concerned about building a better society is incredibly difficult. And so there are so many layers of damage to the fabric and the solidarity of civil society actors that it becomes really hard to even find a starting place to build from. And so the work that we're doing in Egypt is really about, finding the beginnings of solidarity, repairing relationships. And for me, this is an example where the agents of organized violence and torture have been successful in their work. They've divided us so much that for us to even begin to do the work requires some initial foundation building work. And the same kind of thing is true of countries in Southeast Asia, where I've had the privilege to work with so many incredibly brave people who are often working in isolation. And to link to the other theme, when you are fragmented, when there is no solidarity, then your agency is very limited. Then you're a couple of people fighting the machine, and the machine is huge, and the machine is powerful, and there's no room. And so, yes, I think these are universal themes to guide the work. And in every case, how we operationalize them, how that turns into the work on the ground looks different in every community, in every country.
Thanks very much, Craig. I'd like to change the program slightly and move to Aska. Aska, you sit at the apex of a vast network of organizations dealing with all the problems that Craig has outlined for us. And the IRCT has been a light in the world for decades now in the anti-torture movement. And these are now actually quite dark times, from the halcyon days when we set up the IRCT and the Vienna Declaration, and the Vienna Conference, and the passing of all sorts of important international conventions. What has happened is we've now seem to be on the edge of a really dark age. Democracy in retreat, and much greater concerns. And so I'd be very interested in your remarks from where you sit at the apex of, I'm not entirely sure anymore how many organizations belong to the IRCT, but they cover every single continent, and they deal with ongoing violence, and they deal with people who fled violence into Denmark and Sweden and Britain and everywhere else. So Aska, I know you're pressed for time, but we'd be very grateful for your remarks. Aska, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tony, and really thanks for switching around. And I apologize. I had a conflicting thing with my son's school that they will not be very happy if I skip, unfortunately. So it's one of those family things you can't get out of. And thank you so much for those nice words about the IRCT. It's extremely kind, and I think that the organization has not always lived up to those words, but I hope that we do so now, and that we can continue to do so in the future. So this is a bit of it's always a very, I think, interesting but also slightly difficult way to come into this discussion from the IRCT, because I think we recognize that the situation in the countries where we work is highly complex, and we are not the national experts, and we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So what we can try to do is share the things that we see around in the network, around in the world, that might be useful, and then you should obviously feel free to discard it. I can also share some and I will some thoughts and also reflections on what Craig was saying from my time working for 15 years now in the organization as a legal professional, and I think finally maybe I can give a little bit of hope. At least I hope so. But let me just start by, I mean, I was listening to Craig, and it just kind of made my mind almost explode in all the things that I thought I wanted to say. But I think, you know, when you talk about healing and justice, it is very illustrative of one of the problems that we are still grappling with in this sector, which is that the legal professions and let me call them health professionals, or the people who come more from the healing side, we have still not found I think the most effective way of working together and really strengthening each other. So for example, one of the things that we can see is that, and I think this very much goes along with what Craig is saying, is that while the legal construct of reparation and the 5 forms and so on, it is helpful as a way for lawyers and legal mechanisms to think about what is it that we are obligated to do when somebody has been exposed to a violation. But it makes it extremely difficult to bring survivors and victims' perspectives and needs into that discussion, because it is so highly legally theorized. I mean, it's really just, it's a theory about what people need or should have, but it's very, very difficult often to match that with reality. So one of the things, well, 2 things that we're trying to do in that regard, and that hopefully, I hope this can be useful, because it is a bit, it's not directly focused on Zimbabwe. But 2 things. One is that we are working very actively now to dispel this notion that documentation of torture is only important for criminal justice purposes, and really trying to move into an understanding where this is actually much more a continuum, where the first value of documenting torture is simply that you help to establish the truth, that you put some kind of credible evidence to what has happened, so that it is no longer as deniable, and that we start to try to help contribute to creating some kind of of history, in the understanding that maybe in 20 years, it can also be used to hold perpetrators accountable. But even if it never is, it is still very valuable because it helps to start both for the individual, but also for the community and society, to start more, let's say, objectively establishing what has happened. And I know for all of you, this sounds totally trivial, but from the legal and the international law perspective, it isn't. And that's part of the problem, because as long as lawyers dominate that part of the discussion, it often becomes about, well, why would we document? Because there's no perspective of ever having a criminal case, right? So that is something that we work very hard to deal with. Another issue, and this comes very close to what Craig was talking about, is that we are trying to make sure that the different international investigations, so investigations by the UN especially, of mass atrocities like the situation in Syria and Yemen and many other places where they open investigations, that has a much stronger focus on rehabilitation and reparation, but also on trying to understand what is it that victims want from these processes, because all these investigations are ultimately created with some kind of vision that in the future there will be a transitional scenario. But what we're struggling with, and what I'm really hoping that, and I was very inspired already from Craig's presentation, but this is something that I think we can all take forward together. What we're struggling with is to say, well, how do we actually merge when you have the UN who has to speak into these 5 different forms of reparations, and which are quite meaningless as a framework for asking survivors or victims what they want. How do we start actually really talking together so that we can get some real empowerment of victims and survivors also in these processes? So that's really something that that we are. These are some of the things we're working on at the moment. Parts of it we're actually doing with CSVR, and I think this is also something that we are extremely proud of in recent years in IRCT, to that we are increasingly actually really understanding how much knowledge and value sits in the individual members, and try to harvest that so that it can be made available to everyone. Just maybe a couple of other points on this. We are, and to get a little bit more practical, we are in the process of developing a series of documentation tools that are intended to be used in situations of protest. So that might be something that colleagues in Zimbabwe could find useful to looking into the future. They're designed. Some are designed for health professionals, but many of them are also designed for laypersons. So basically, protesters and activists to use to start the process of documenting and understanding more basic principles around how to do that. The second more practical point, I guess, that I just wanted to highlight was the adoption last year of the IRCT's global standards on rehabilitation, which we hope, being a document that the membership has negotiated since 2015, we really hope that one of the utilities of it can be that our members can use it as a dialogue tool, both with states but also with donors, to show this is what it should look like, this is what you should pay for, and therefore hopefully be a help in putting a little bit more of an, let's say, objective basis for that discussion that of course we hope to have. so that while we try to prevent torture from happening, those that are still tortured are not left without support. And I think now for the hope. So I I agree with you, Tony, that I mean, these are dark times. I'm currently based in Mexico, where I work from, and I can assure you that the situation here, both in terms of how much torture, how many disappearances, and how little justice there is, it is not promising. But there are two things that I think from our sector is really promising. The one is that we see that people have not stopped going to the street to demand democracy. Quite the contrary, they continue and they increasingly go to the street to demand democracy and human rights. So it is also a time where there is not an acceptance in many of these societies of the way that things are going. There is still a lot of resistance and I think growing young popular movements who really want something different. And I think that is really promising. I think the other thing, and this is a little bit more close to home, that is promising for me, is that probably for the first time since I have been in the IRCT, so the last 15 years, the international anti-torture movement, so the between 5 and 10 organizations that work, let's say more or less globally on torture-related issues, have finally come together in a much stronger sense of unity and no longer fighting each other over petty little things. And I think that brings hope, because it also brings possibilities for much more united action. For example, if we're looking at a new scenario with elections in Zimbabwe, and if there is, if you think that there is a relevance and need for more concerted international action, possibly even before, that is much more likely to work, to be completely frank, today than it was 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. And I think that for our little sector, that for me gives me a lot of hope. So I think I'll end with that. We are, these tools that I talked about, we are also presenting them to the PARI network. I didn't have a slide, so I haven't put up my email. But Tony, you have it, and you're more than welcome to share it. It's not a secret at all. So, but we're really we're not as big as we used to be, but with the resources that we have, we're more than happy to really engage and see how we can best be supportive with something that actually makes a difference for you. So, but thank you so much for hosting this, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Asker. I'm not sure how quickly you have to rush before the teacher spanks you and your son, but maybe I can post something to you that links to both Craig and yourself. And that is many years ago, in the aftermath of what people call the third wave of democracy, the collapse of the European autocracies in Latin America, Louis Joinet posed 4 fundamental rights to be able to deal with the situations that deal with: the right to truth, the right to justice, the right to non-recurrence, and the right to reparation. It strikes me that one of the things that has happened to the anti-torture movement is, and I'm picking up very much on your notion of lawyers talking to healers, is we've disaggregated them. People work on different channels. You know, I work on justice, I work on truth, I work on this. Surely one of the answers is, and I think that's implicit in what Craig's talking about, is let's put the whole together. You can't solve this problem without this holistic notion. I'm hearing what you're saying, that this is a new learning. Is my sense of this correct?
So I think I'll give you one of the few anecdotes that I know from before my own time at IRCT. So during the very first meeting of the UN Committee Against Torture, I believe it was back in 1989, the committee met for the very first time. They had their first session, and they all of the committee members, they went out for dinner the same night. During the dinner, one of the committee members, who was a lawyer, he's one out of 9 lawyers in the committee at that time, he asks Ben Johnson, who was one of the founders of the IRCT, who was also a member of the committee, he asked him, "So what are you doing here? You're a doctor." And then Ben Johnson responded, "What are you all 9 doing here? You're lawyers, right?" And so that's where it started. And so there was this total sense of, no, I own this, I own this, I own this. That then, I mean, this is my perception of history, right? Then there has been, and there continues to be, something that I'm sure psychologists can analyze, which is a quite interesting cross fascination where many health professionals in our sector try to be lawyers because they're very fascinated with that, and many of the lawyers try to be health professionals because we're very fascinated with that, and that has kind of seems to have been going on all of the time. Then with the Istanbul Protocol, we managed to somehow meet in a way where we said, okay, my skills come in and do this and this and this, and your skills come in and do this and this and this, and that actually creates something quite cool and effective together, right? And we still do that. I think what we are missing is to go from, I don't know if I'm using the right English terminology, but from collaborating to converging, or to merging, in a sense, where you create a space where it's not law and health, but where it's something different, right? And we haven't gotten there yet. I hope we will at least get fragments of it. We probably already have fragments of it, but that's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for in this work with understanding how can we, because we tell the UN, okay, but when you interview victims to get to log violations, you cannot just ask them that. I mean, you need to also, you are after all foreseeing transitional justice processes. You need to ask them what they want. But then they say, okay, but so should I ask them, you know, do you want guarantee of non-repetition? Do you want satisfaction? Do you want rehabilitation? You know, how the hell are they going to answer that question, right? And so that's what we're missing. In my mind. I mean, there are many other things, but at least in that particular area. So I'm really sorry. I have to run now. If it goes quick, I will come right back in. And I really hope we can continue this discussion. But I hope it was that was at least my version of IRCT / history. So yeah.
Oscar, thank you very much. I think that was a very helpful comment there at the end about the difficulties of bringing so many different people. And I think that speaks to the heart of what Craig was talking about, the way in which organized violence and torture fragments society and breaks them into different groups, and how hard it is. And I think is illustration of how difficult it is in Egypt. So good luck. May the teacher not beat you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope to see you in a short while.
Thank you. Right, moving along. Anna Moya. Anna has been working in this field for an immensely long time, and working as a Zimbabwean with the Zimbabweans. In the little discussion we had at the beginning, she and a former colleague who were working together You know, sometimes this work feels like it was 100 years ago. Remember that they were working together in Johannesburg, working with Zimbabwean refugees who were tortured. Anna, you have a wealth of experience on Zimbabwe and working on South Africa, and I'd like to hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. It's really lovely to be in this meeting and also to hear from colleagues that we are working together, with Craig, Asker, on some of these issues. We've worked at a national level, but also we've escalated this work, upscaled it, and brought it to the regional and the international forums. So it's really excited to be part of this forum as well. And also just to reconnect as well with former colleagues. My very first stint as a human rights lawyer was with the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum, where we worked a lot with torture victims who were refugees and asylum seekers coming from Zimbabwe back in 2007. And just some of the harrowing stories and experiences of torture survivors at the time, to someone fresh from university, having just done masters in human rights and constitutional practice, but not ready to hear some of these stories, and linking at that time with CSVR to provide psychosocial support services to some of our clients at the time, doing litigation at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, but also just working with survivors, linking them to some of the services and ensuring their documentation and their legal status in South Africa. Indeed, Tony, it has been quite an experience. So I work for an organization that has done some of this work, and as Tony highlighted in the beginning, some of the initial work around mental health and psychosocial support through a consortium with Tree of Life and other organizations, Amani Trust. They were all part of that consortium of organizations that offered these specialized services to survivors of organized violence and torture in Africa. And fast forward, we now have the Pan-African Reparations Initiative that Asker spoke a bit about, PARI, where some of the organizations, CSU, Tree of Life, are part of this initiative. And we have done a lot around ensuring that we provide policy instruments, soft law instruments at a continental level that speaks to the real needs of victims and survivors of torture and organized violence in Africa. And one of our documents that we have produced, soft law instruments that we've produced at the African Commission level, is general comment number 4 on redress for victims of torture in Africa, which really centers the experiences of victims and survivors of torture into the services, be it legal services, psychosocial services, and so forth, and also ensures that the primary objective of redress should be the healing of survivors and victims of torture. So everything should really bring us to that one goal, overall goal or outcome of healing of survivors and victims of torture in Africa. So we are really excited about that. And PARI in 2021, last year, launched the Rehabilitation Manual that also documents some of the experiences of practitioners in providing rehabilitation to survivors of torture in Africa. And CSU took the lead in developing that document together with partners, IRCT, CSVR, Tree of Life, amongst others, who really came together and put together those experiences towards ensuring that service providers, be it from government, civil society actors, community-based actors, also get first-hand knowledge of how to implement mental health and psychosocial support services for victims of torture, taking into account some of the experiences of victims and exactly what Craig spoke about earlier, doing it in a way that really means a lot and ensures that what victims need or what they foresee or would describe healing, what they will describe reparation, what they will describe rehabilitation for them would be, and working around providing those kind of interventions and initiatives that are meaningful to the victim, not those that are too removed from what victims will deem to be to lead to their healing. Without much further ado, I'll speak a bit and maybe just pick a few points from what has been presented. Craig spoke earlier about some of the helplessness and the power dimensions of torture. I think one of the most unfortunate things about the crime of torture is that victims are helpless. When we are talking about assault and other crimes that can be committed by anyone, at least the victim would have an opportunity to fight back. But when the assault is being committed against a victim or a survivor by someone who is uniformed or a uniformed state personnel, like a police officer, someone from the army, someone from the intelligence. Well, the intelligence does not wear uniform, but they are feared because of the office that they represent at the time of committing the torture act. So victims are helpless, survivors are helpless. They cannot fight back because of the power dimension. And not only that, Craig also spoke about some of the impacts of torture on the lives of victims. I just want to echo that in our dealing with victims of torture from Zimbabwe in South Africa, who have come to South Africa as refugees and asylum seekers, the very same impacts have been recorded. The neurological symptoms that Craig spoke about, the physical impacts, the psychological impacts, and so forth. And what has also become quite evident from our experiences from the work that we do in our trauma clinic, providing MHPSS or mental health and psychosocial support services to victims, is that sense of helplessness, suicidal thoughts, for instance, the anger, the frustration, the inability to deal with interpersonal relationships, inability to hold down a job because of the trauma, unresolved trauma that many of the survivors will be presenting with. And in our experiences with dealing with victims who are refugees and asylum seekers, is that many of them would have left their countries of origin with merely the clothes on their back, with no documentation whatsoever. They would have left homes, they would have left their jobs, they would have left their livelihoods, sources of livelihoods. And coming to start a life in South Africa really becomes an arduous task. And add onto that the daily stressors of not finding a job, failing to get documentation because of high levels of corruption in South Africa. Add also onto that as well, xenophobic attacks and xenophobic violence in South Africa that threatens many of them who may have had at least gone on a healing journey through some of the services we provide, the relapse into that traumatic experience, the reliving of the trauma. These are some of the challenges that refugees and asylum seekers who are torture victims usually contend with. Whilst other migrants may have the alternative of going back to their countries of origin, for refugees and asylum seekers, this alternative or this option of returning back to their countries of origin is taken away because they are under the protection of the South African government. So it means that then they become victims of these xenophobic violence, xenophobic tendencies, xenophobic attacks in South Africa, and they're helpless even within this environment to fight back or to speak up about their rights. There's also a lot of exploitation from the labor market in South Africa because most of them, they can't really speak up or speak about their labor rights or ask for better pay from employers. So again, all of these daily stressors, additional stressors, further exacerbate the traumatic experiences and the suffering that many victims of torture or survivors of torture who are refugees and asylum seekers are subjected to. The impacts of COVID-19 have also added onto their experiences, forcing them to relive their trauma and relapse back into that place of traumatization. We have seen, for instance, many refugees and asylum seekers losing their jobs. And in South Africa currently, we are also seeing the increase of xenophobic messaging, xenophobic threats, xenophobic violence, the mobilization against non-nationals in South Africa, most of whom are refugees and asylum seekers. So in communities where they live in, WhatsApp messages are going around where South Africans are mobilizing around removing or evacuating non-nationals within their communities. There is a current operation right now that is being implemented at various levels. The police, political elites are also calling for it. It's called Operation Dudula, which really has many refugees and asylum seekers sitting on edge because they don't know what this means for them. And definitely it is a security threat for refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. The migration laws as well, we are seeing a closing up as well for many who are on the ZSP permits, again, having been told that their permits will not be renewed going forward. Some of those who opted for those permits are actually recognized or they do apply. They also double up as refugees and asylum seekers who then took advantage of these permits, which offer much more better protection and renewal than refugee permits or asylum seeker permits that are more that have got a lot of corruption when refugees or asylum seekers are trying to renew them, and sometimes the periods within which to renew them are very short, 3 months, 6 months to a year sometimes, and there's a lot of corruption, backlogs, and so forth from Home Affairs in migrants legalizing their stay, especially for refugees and asylum seekers for getting those papers, refugee status or asylum seeker permits, for instance. So there is a lot of issues that refugees and asylum seekers are facing in South Africa, and some of this is coming out a lot in some of the work that we are doing with refugees and asylum seekers. Another challenge that we have always emphasized is the disenfranchisement of the refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants who are in South Africa, especially when it comes to exercising their right to vote in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwean government has not afforded them an opportunity or made platforms for them available to vote in South Africa. So they are not participating in these governance processes or democratic processes in South Africa or in Zimbabwe. Therefore, this disenfranchised group of migrants, again, almost exist in a no man's land when it comes to exercising their governance rights and responsibilities as citizens, and also as their active citizenship as citizens of a particular country. So these are some of the issues that many victims or survivors of organized violence and torture are facing in South Africa. Another big challenge that also derails the healing process or the healing journey of many victims or survivors of torture who are refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa is just the unwillingness of the South African government currently to open up spaces and accommodate Zimbabweans in South Africa. I think as far as 5 years back, South Africa started not receiving Zimbabweans as refugees or asylum seekers, even in instances where it is clear that the person fleeing has fled political persecution, and if they had remained in their country of origin, there are high chances that they will be tortured or even be killed or be further subjected to persecution. So that political or that policy change or that policy decision has also affected the flight of Zimbabweans into South Africa or other neighboring countries seeking refuge. And this further exacerbates the trauma, the reliving of the trauma for many of them who are torture victims, there is nowhere to run to. Botswana has adopted the same policy. It's not accepting Zimbabweans, it's actually turning many Zimbabweans back home. And what does this mean for recognized refugees and asylum seekers? It really means that this experience or the fear of being deported and being sent back to Zimbabwe also causes additional trauma and forces them to relapse in some of the gains or some of the journey that they would have taken towards their healing. And we are seeing a lot of this presenting in a number of clients that we are seeing in South Africa. Many of them relapsing in their healing journey, many of them going back to trauma, many of them coming back and having undone all of the healing process and benefits that we have worked with them over a number of years. So again, this has impacts as well on the work that we are doing in providing mental health and psychosocial support. Perhaps also in this report that has been produced, just looking again and us coming together as practitioners, discussing how can we mitigate some of the additional stressors, the emerging issues that cause some of the survivors to relapse in their healing journeys and go back into the traumatic experience. How can we mitigate this going forward? And how can we create circles of healing that go beyond providing psychosocial support, but leaning onto communities, leaning onto other support networks that could provide some of these services that are most needed by victims. I think Craig started us off on that journey when he spoke about the need now to look at what exists in some of the communities, what exists from faith-based actors, what exists, for instance, as support networks that survivors can lean onto, that can then be upscaled and built upon to provide holistic services and a holistic approach to providing help to survivors of torture and organized violence in Zimbabwe and beyond. I'll end here for now. Tony, I think my time is up already. I think a lot has been said as well. I was just now adding some of my experiences and experiences of CSVR in doing this work. Thank you.
No, Anna, you added a very important dimension to this, and that is that what organized violence and torture does, it forces people to move. Those of you who've been watching the Ukraine experience, where the EU is preparing for a flood of people out of the Ukraine as a consequence of war or organized violence and torture. So that's very important. And I have a question for you, just a quickie, and that is that CSVR has been very intimately concerned with the AU process on transitional justice. To what extent do you think that is, and given what Craig and Asker said, to what extent do you think this is really victim-centered or is filling in the gaps that are much more legalistic?
Thank you, Tony, for that question. The African Union Transitional Justice Policy has a specific focus on refugees, internally displaced persons, and other migrants, looking at some of their experiences and how through transitional justice, for instance, we can attend to some of those challenges and specific issues that they're dealing with. For instance, there's some of the issues that I have raised, the inability to participate in the transitional justice process in the country of origin because they're in a different country altogether, and the exclusion that they usually encounter when these processes are being undertaken in a country of origin. And when reparations are being awarded, for instance, because they would not have participated in the process, in most instances, they become ineligible to receive reparations. We've seen it with the African case, for instance. Those who participated in the TRC are the ones who became eligible to receive reparations, and those who didn't come forward to to share their experiences or as witnesses were found not to be eligible for reparations. So this exclusion is a big issue for refugees, asylum seekers, or the exiled community when transitional justice processes are being undertaken. The policy at the African Union level highlights some of these challenges and calls for a robust approach, amongst other things, to include the exiled communities. I think in practice, the Gambia has done very well. It's one of the countries that we are working in, providing technical support in the transitional justice process. The Gambia, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission has done this very well. We had commissioners go to the diaspora, look for the exiled community and get their testimonies from where they are based, and encouraging them to come forward. So those moves or those outreach processes actually enabled the exiled communities to be part and parcel of the TRRC process in the Gambia, to give testimony and to be eligible for reparations, where these will be awarded in future as part of the recommendations. So we really need to include the exiled community, the refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers who are based in other countries. And the AUTJP provides for us some benchmarks on how this can be done successfully in practice.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was very helpful input. Okay, our last presenter, Olivia Manguiro. We've been north and south, and Olivia's at the coalface. This particular report is part of a series that people may have been watching. I'm part of a consortium of organizations, RAU, CSU, the Human Rights NGO Forum, Veritas, and Youth Zimbabwe. And we've been releasing these reports, I think very much in mind with what Craig has been saying about how we need to change the narratives. And so these reports have all been about the history. Now, this is about the present. Olivia works in the present. She works with the current victims as well as victims of past gross human rights violations. Olivia, I'd like to invite you in and welcome.
Thank you so much, Tony, and good evening to all the participants. I'm here representing Counseling Services Unit, and my presentation will touch heavily on our work here in Counseling Services Unit, CSU. And first and foremost, I would like to pay homage to the groundbreaking work done by Amani Trust and the other forebearers or predecessors that worked with OVTs or survivors of organized violence and torture before us. We as CSU, we taking over or continuing the work that was done by Amani Trust. And we have actually built on that foundation as well. As a Counseling Services Unit, we started our operation in 2003 as a medical rehabilitation center for victims of organized violence and torture in Zimbabwe. And we have been in this work for the past 18 years. And to date, we've seen more than 28,000 individuals. They have received our services. And most of our clients, these are the victims and survivors of organized violence and torture, come from rural communities, and they have experienced the multiple incidents of torture and violence since 2000. So it's a very common phenomenon at CSU for us to see clients repeatedly in connection with the different incidents that happen across time. And in the rural areas, I think the main reason is the main reason why we have a huge number of clients coming from that area could be a result of paucity or lack of information on human rights to our rural communities, to the extent that they are not able to really properly defend themselves And it's a gap that we have actually also seen at CSU, and we are working to ensure that our rural communities receive information on human rights and electoral laws in Zimbabwe through our call center networks. And at CSU, our main vision is to build a democratic and torture-free Zimbabwe, just like the other organization and what the other speakers have said. And this is mainly centered on providing a comprehensive rehabilitation and also prevention of torture. And this is also done working with clients, communities, and institutions of the state. When we talk about comprehensive rehabilitation, we are talking of a rehabilitation that is holistic, in the sense that we are looking at different services and needs of clients being provided under one roof. And that's what CSU does as a medical rehabilitation center. We offer psychosocial support to our clients, and we also offer medical rehabilitation for our clients, as well as legal advice to our clients. So this is in line with our goal to provide a comprehensive rehabilitation center. And also another aspect of our work is to ensure the prevention of torture victims. This is done through our programs of disseminating information on human rights, electoral laws, like I said, and issues to do with psychological torture, identification, and treatment. This is all done as a bid to prevent the reoccurrence of torture. And very, very importantly, like what Craig talked about, is our work of bringing communities together in this work is something that we really focus on at Counseling Services Unit. We do not only work with clients, but we work with the communities from which the clients come from. We work with the civic organizations. We work with the faith-based institutions, as well as at times institutions of the state. So this is just the background of the work that CSU does with the clients. And it's very important to take note that our work also involves close cooperation with the community coordinators. These are coordinators that are already existing within the communities. This is something that we realized as we continued with our work with victims and survivors of organized violence and torture, that we do not really need to create a new system, but to take advantage of a system that is already existing. So you find that certain civil organizations have got community coordinators in the rural communities. And we also have political institutions that have community coordinators. So we make use of these community coordinators in identification of our clients, as well as in the dissemination of information related to human rights violation and prevention of human rights violation. These community coordinators help us to identify the clients, and also they help to coordinate the clients so that they can come to our center to receive the treatment that is on offer. And a lot of verification also happens in our team, so that we are sure that we are really dealing with the right clients that are related to organized violence and torture. And one of the strengths of our intervention is that our intervention is client-focused, focusing on the needs of the client. So we do a lot of interaction with the client so that the client can feel comfortable to make use of the resources that we have on offer, because what we are offering the clients is a holistic approach with the different services to meet their needs. For some clients, they might opt for legal redress. For others, their healing will come through counseling, interaction with others. And part of the counseling aspect, we also do have art therapy, and we have the craft. And so the client is given a lot of choices to choose from. But all these processes take place after we have documented the client's stories. And before the documentation of the client story, one of the things that we really pay cognizant of is to ensure the safety of the client. The safety involves psychological safety, where we assess the risk of the client to suicide, to harm. This is done using the assessment tools that we have here. We also look at the safety of the client in terms of where they're coming from, as well as the safety of the clients when they come to our center. Usually they come to our center in groups, but we also have walk-in clients coming in. And once they're in here, Craig talked about issues of fragmentation and silence coming from resulting from OVT victimization. It's something that we really pay cognizant of, and we really work very hard in ensuring that our clients are comfortable enough. We built a lot of trust with them so that they are free enough to talk to us, because they have been silenced by the system. Now we're bringing them to our center, and we want them now to begin talking. So a lot of groundwork is done in terms of ensuring their safety, building their trust, and stabilizing their emotion so that they can begin to talk. And once they're able to talk, we document their histories. This documentation is also used for medical. We also compile medical affidavits based on the documentation that would have been provided in case the client might choose to seek legal redress. So that is part of the work that we do in terms of addressing the needs of the clients. And one of our strengths is that we do not work in isolation. I know our previous speaker talked about the importance of working with other service providers and creating a network of service providers that meet the needs of our survivors. So at CSU, we have been working very closely on that, and we've a very strong network of service providers that we work with in providing the needs of our survivors and victims of organized violence and torture. And this network includes, like I said before, the civil society, political institutions. At times, we also work with government institutions and the faith healers. So we do have a directory of service providers who will link our clients to, depending on their needs. Excuse me. And in our work, we have also taken note, like what Tony pointed out in the report, the shortage of mental health practitioners. Yes, this was a problem in the 1990s with the money trust, and it continuously it's still a continuous problem with us, given the brain drain of our health practitioners going to greener pastures. So we have taken note of that, and in order to mitigate for this, we have embarked on a series of training of healthcare workers in the identification and management of psychological trauma. So these healthcare workers are found in the district hospitals, in the communities where the survivors are coming from. So they represent us when we are not there. And they are usually the first point of contact if the clients face any challenges. So with these healthcare workers, we have capacitated them with skills related to identification and management of trauma, the basic stuff. And in some instances, we have also given them information on human rights violation, electoral laws, so that they are able to offer a complete package to our clients in places where we cannot reach them. Interestingly, we have also started a new program, which has really been well received, of providing basic training on cognitive behavioral therapy to rehab technicians in district hospitals. So we are really expanding our reach in communities through these healthcare workers. A very good example of task shifting in mental health, which has been very helpful to make to fill up the gaps of shortages of health practitioners in the mental health field. We also have doctors in the communities that have also become a network of our service providers. Sometimes we are not able to respond immediately to injuries, but we do have doctors in various communities also that are able to respond to issues of emergency. So this is something that we have built over time. And I'm glad to say that because of such structures, we're able to reach to quite a huge, a broad network of communities, especially those that experience organized violence and torture. And also interestingly is also our work with the clients. We are really driven by the principle of converting the victim to become a survivor. And then in this respect, after providing all the therapy work and when the client is more stable, we empower the client with skills related.
Please, Anna. I mean,
sorry, should I continue?
Yeah, 1 minute, please.
Oh, 1 minute. Okay, I'm almost done. Yeah, so it's also empowering clients also so that they can also reach out to other clients in their communities. And we have encouraged our clients to provide peer support groups to other clients. So this is also our attempt to broaden our services to the clients. 1 minute left. So I think one thing that I really wanted to mention is the aspect of looking at OVT as work that is also extending in the extractive industries, because of recent, we have also been receiving incidences of torture, violence in the extractive industries like mining. So it's another area that we also need to look into and to find out ways in which we can assist to alleviate this problem. I think like what Tony said in the report, most of the work is done by the NGOs. It would be very good to also involve the government. I know we have also been working with the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but more work can be done with them. And I think this report really will send the message that is very important to involve the government. And in my view, if the government is involved, cases of impunity really can also be reduced, because they will also push forward for the arrest of some of the perpetrators that have violated our clients. And I think with that, I'll end my discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I mean, you raised the breadth and depth of the difficulties of being an NGO working with organized violence and torture. I'm looking at time here, and I'd like to, at this particular point, throw the floor open to folk who have comments or observations. So if you just go to the little box at the bottom that has reactions, put your hand up. We'd be very happy to hear from you. I'll give you a minute. Any comments? So far, I think a very rich and complex discussion. While I'm waiting for people to feed in, it raises extremely broad and difficult problems, from Craig through to Asghar, through to Anna, talking about north of the Limpopo, and then to Olivia talking about south of the Limpopo, and the difficulties faced by Zimbabwe, but many countries in the world face this problem where organized violence and torture takes place. I'm just looking to see if there are hands up there. If they're not, maybe I could go back sequentially. Oh, Lynn Walker, please, and unmute yourself. Okay, Lynn.
Good evening, Tony. Good evening, Craig and Anna and Olivia. And well, just first of all, thank you very much, all of you, for your really amazing presentations and the richness and the depth of the points that you've made, the presentation you've made. And I guess really it isn't really anything new, but I just really wanted to endorse so many points that have been made by the different presenters, from the perspective of Tree of Life, and how much we've really appreciated the partnership and the collaboration that we've done with many of the agencies that have spoken, you know, over the years, to reiterate that. And I really wanted to pick up on some really important points, and I think Olivia picked up on it as well, about the fact that the importance of community. And Craig talked about that, about how fragmentation happens at various levels, and that how, you know, healing, you need to address the fragmentation at those various levels, the isolation, the stigma, and the role that community plays in that, and the role of having responses and rehabilitation services focusing at community level, rather than being overly clinical, but that layering is really important, that you have the clinical responses, and then you have the graduation and the layering into community responses. And that's certainly something that as Tree of Life we've really found. And to really echo something that Craig said about how you need to listen to victims, and how many of the victims we talk about really, yeah, Craig, echo what you said about, for them healing is not a legal pathway, it's not getting compensation or whatever. It is actually about moving on with your life, being able to find yourself again, find your community, have hope for the future, and to move on with your life with a sense of hope. And that is so important. So for so many survivors of organised violence and torture. And also, just to echo one of the things that I think was said also by Anna and others about involving survivors, involving them in services, and not just at a peripheral level. I mean, I think we often see lip service paid to that. You know, the survivors are wheeled out to give testimony at times when, you know, organisations like us are doing public events, but actually involving them in the rehabilitation process, as I think Olivia said, involving them in the support at community level. And that's not just a really kind of wise way to do rehabilitation. It's part of a rehabilitation process for the survivors themselves. I mean, we're a survivor-led organisation, and the survivors in Tree of Life say part of their rehabilitation was being able to help other people. Part of their sense of agency and moving on with their lives is actually seeing other survivors move on with their lives and start to recover from their traumatic experiences. So I just really wanted to endorse so many amazing things that have been said this evening, and to thank you all. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Sunanda, long time. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I've just put a link in the chat to an interview with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US. And she was asked whether she would ever give up her position as a politician and return to doing community activism. And her advice, it was towards the end of the interview, her advice was that it's the only way to combat hopelessness. That when people are feeling hopeless, then the way to get out of it is by doing something. And, you know, I'm still doing a lot of work with junior doctors on mentoring them and trying to help them cope with this extreme sense of hopelessness. And I think the time, I can't remember his name actually, Peter, someone or another, when one of their junior doctors was kidnapped and was then found a few days later, apparently having been tortured, that really mobilized them all to protest and to withdraw their services. It's that act of doing something that helps people carry on. And I think that's what we have to combat. There's such an extreme loss of morale right now that it's often hard to know what to do. But there are small things that can be done. And I think we should look for those, because the whole issue about violence, as I said in the chat earlier, goes much, much wider than just what's happened to torture victims. You know, people are still reeling from what happened in Gukrohundi. They're reeling from what happened with the neglect of the AIDS pandemic. They're now trying to cope with COVID, with the loss of a lot of people, a lot of colleagues, and it just goes on and on, one thing after another. And we've had more than 20 years of this. So we have to find ways of addressing this concept this hopelessness that comes with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sananda. I think that's a very important observation, and I think links very strongly to what Craig spoke at the beginning about the fragmentation and the destruction of social capital, if I can do that. I'm mindful of time, so before I make some winding up remarks, perhaps I can go back. I think it was a very specific question to Craig, so maybe I'll start with you. I don't know, Craig, if you saw that in the chat, and maybe you can address that, and maybe we can have some comments then from Anna and Olivia and Oscar, who I think has come back from being beaten up by his teacher. Craig, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, as I reconsider that word reasonable, I do think it sort of implies that what is in the legal frameworks that guides us is somehow unreasonable, which is certainly not what I intended to imply at all. But some of the responses we've been having is, for example, to be treated with sufficient dignity to be able to create a home for themselves in the country that they find themselves in now. So this was with a refugee population, and a refugee population in a fairly xenophobic context, and people really suffering with a sense of loss of home and everything that home means, and how that plays out intergenerationally, where children are then born into a new society. It's the only society they know, but their parents are holding on to a memory of a home that's been destroyed and a home that's been lost to them. And listening to people talk about, we just wish we had space and respect from the community around us to be able to recreate a home and a space for our culture and our language and our traditions and our children. And that would be both justice and healing for us. And that's, that's challenged me to really think about what home means, what family means. It certainly ties in with the psychological constructs of ambiguous loss, where you're trying to recreate something and you're imagining how it should be, but it's never quite what you want. The ambiguous loss people talk about something being there and not there at the same time. So that's one example. Other examples are around things like memorialization. And I want to dig in on this one just briefly, because here I've been involved with the International Criminal Court and their work in northern Uganda and the war with the LRA. And what's happened there is certain communities have been kind of pulled out and used as exemplars or examples of the atrocities committed in the war with the LRA, not always by the LRA. And they've received some reparations at a community level, but their neighbors who went through exactly the same stuff, their story isn't told at all. And so a lot of the discussions about justice are actually about equity within and between communities who have been impacted by organized violence and torture. And so it's a different lens to the kind of lens that I would have automatically brought to it. I hope that helps a little bit. I know we're out of time.
Thanks, Craig. Were there any other comments you wanted to make at this point?
I just really wanted to underline the first comment in the chat about how do we sustain and support the community of people working for justice and healing in the world and in Zimbabwe. I think that's fundamental. I think it's about security. I think it's about care for each other. Again, it's about solidarity. One of the things CVT offers is that we manage a measure called the Professional Quality of Life measure, I will write the website into the chat, but that's a tool that people can use to monitor their own well-being over time. We've also added a new version of it. We've added a lot of sort of just handouts for tools on self-care, and so you know, the more we bring material into that realm of supporting the advocates and the healers, then, you know, the longer we're going to be sustainable and the better we're going to do.
Thank you, Greg. And thanks to CVT, who've been in the struggle a long time, and you just as long. Maybe I can move to Aska. I think you're back and probably not beaten up by your teacher. I wondered whether you had any last remarks on what you've been able to pick since then. Aska, over to you. Aska, maybe you're here but not here. Okay, Anna, perhaps you can give some last reflections on what.
Thank you, Tony, for this. My last reflections really were also based on some of my very long presentation, but I also wanted to talk about just how the framing of survivors and victims of torture. I know at CSVR we are talking a lot, we have been for the past few years talking a lot about the issue of leadership and woundedness, and how some of this woundedness, for instance, has really trickled through from leaders who, for instance, saw a lot of things during the liberation struggle, but were victims at the time, but also the cyclical nature of perpetrators turned victims and victims turned perpetrators, and how this plays out in society, and how we address it as well in helping survivors of organized violence and torture. And what we have noticed in some of the work that we are doing is that wounded leaders lead from their trauma, and some of their responses are actually traumatic responses. And this usually perpetuates the violence that we see in society and in communities. They are unable to lead from a place of peace, or being peace enablers, so they lead from their wounds. We have communities as well that are wounded, and when communities are wounded, some of their responses are also wounded responses. And within communities, we have leaders at various levels, family leaders, we have church leaders, we have directors and so forth, and their leading also is from this wounded place, place or a traumatic place. And of course, we have wounded individuals. Again, when we look at the bottom-up approach, wounded leaders become members of a society. And when we have wounded members, then we have a wounded society. When wounded societies or communities, amongst those, we have leaders as well. So it's a cyclical nature that really fits onto it. So how we address issues of trauma and help survivors should also look at this interchangeability between victims or victimhood and perpetratorhood, and how we address that through a mental health and psychosocial support lens is also important towards healing survivors and achieving sustainable peace in societies and in communities. Thank you, Tony.
That was a very, very important intervention, actually. And I think in Southern Africa, and Craig started off talking a little bit about liberation movements. And liberation movements are movements that are based on war. And I think there's substantial evidence to suggest that the leaders that we have need healing in a very important way. And one of the absences of that healing is part of the problems we face. I think that you bring a new dimension to all the discussions that are going on in the political economy of Southern Africa, about why liberation movements don't transmute into genuine ordinary political parties. And I think that's very important. And CSVR has done some very important work there. Thank you very much. I think it was a very important insight. Olivia, comments, observations?
I think for me, it's very important to work on issues to do with fragmentation and bringing together the communities, importantly, working with the individual and then extending further to the communities, to society as part of healing, not just only focusing on the individual, and also to see whether we can engage the government institution in this whole process of healing and working together as service providers that provide healing. I think for me, this will help a lot in helping the OVT and getting a community that is torture-free. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks very much. Okay, I want to make some remarks at the end here. These were remarks I was really going to make at the end. And I'm very sorry that Francis couldn't be here to lead us through this. I want to make some really somewhat pithy and probably confrontational remarks. I think the first thing that is important to say is that this discussion tonight threw out some obvious and not so obvious conclusions. And specifically in respect of Zimbabwe, but as Craig and other people have pointed out, more broadly than that. Firstly, that what we have to understand about Zimbabwe, there is huge morbidity. What we mean by morbidity are people who are suffering from the consequences of organized violence. And that stretches over 5 decades. We sometimes compartmentalize what we're doing in Zimbabwe into this period and that period. But we have to look at the fact that we have 50 years in which organized violence and torture has been a fundamental part of the way in which we do political problem solving. Secondly, as everybody has pointed out, the evidence shows that the consequences of organized violence and torture are severe, long-term, and require a broad program of assistance. We also have to understand that the consequences come from both the direct experience of OVT, in other words, that you were actually tortured or you lived in a situation in which violence actually happened to you, as well as a situation living where organized violence and torture is common. Some people call this living in a state of terror. But what that means is that you live in a state in which organized violence and torture takes place around you. Even if you're not a direct victim, it's happening around you. That has an impact. And what we've learned from the evidence, Craig was talking about very much about how much we know, that organized violence and torture and terror live side by side. They reinforce each other and they create different kinds of victims and survivors. The evidence on individuals is that organized violence and torture causes post-traumatic stress disorder, and living in a state of terror causes depression. Now, I want to illustrate this by 2 stories. One relates to organized violence and torture, the other relates to terror. The first goes back to the Liberation War, and an interview I had with a very old man who had been tortured during the Liberation War. He had been beaten mercilessly. And one of the consequences of that was that he acquired a very severe back injury. That back injury made it very impossible to this man who lived in Mount Darwin to work in the fields. When he worked in the fields, his back pain was extreme. And the back pain caused him to be a very irritable, angry man. And he would shout at people. And eventually he learned that the shouting at people was making his family unhappy. And so he stopped shouting at people. And the consequence for this man was that he became deeply depressed. He couldn't work in the fields, he became dysfunctional in his family, and his family was deeply worried about why he'd become a withdrawn human being. That's a long-term consequence. This is a man I met and interviewed nearly 3 decades after he'd received this injury during the Liberation War. The second example I want to give you is living in a state of terror. We did some research with the teachers in the aftermath of 2008. And we discovered that the teachers reported that half of them had had an experience of organized violence and torture. And half of them, in other words, 25%, that had happened at school. What that meant was that happened primarily at schools in which were primary schools. These were little children. They watched their teachers get assaulted, humiliated, and beaten in front of all the people, all the pupils. And that was a demonstration of those teachers belonging to a political party. Now, some of those children came from teachers who were at school, some of them came from other families, but all of those little children went home and wondered whether their parents were part of the group that could be assaulted or tortured. And they lived in areas in which teachers and other people in the community were attacked and their houses burnt. So those children grew up in a state of terror. That's in the past, both are in the past, but these may be experiences that children will face here. Now, these are just illustrative, and there are thousands more examples from the reports on organized violence and torture over the years. In fact, there are almost nearly 600 reports on OVT from 1965 onwards. And it tells us that organized violence and torture is the default setting for solving political conflict, and has been for 50 years. If you've got problems with the other side, what you do is you resort to organized violence and torture. It also tells us that the burden of care for these victims is enormous. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people here. And this should be the primary concern of the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. But it isn't. The NPAT, in fact, is concerned with peace and reconciliation and not with the victims and survivors. Now, I mentioned earlier the principles, the Zwane principles, that were argued for a very long time, 1993. The principles that are needed to restore a country to democracy and inclusiveness after periods of organized violence and torture. 4 principles: truth, justice, non-recurrence, and reparations. But the easiest of these is reparations. And the easiest of all of the reparations, which are restitution, compensation, and rehabilitation, is rehabilitation, fixing the people. Now, Zimbabwe is exemplary in the way in which civil society has developed appropriate methods for helping victims and survivors. You've heard that. North and south of the Limpopo, our victims of organized violence and torture are being helped. They're being helped from individual care to group-based and community methods, even down to dealing with the dead, through exhumations and the closure of family grief. And some of these are illustrated in the report that we launched today. Now, this has not been done by the state or the government or independent commissions. It's been done by NGOs and civil society organizations. And now they're under potential attack due to the PVO bill. Now, this is scandalous. It is a scandal that those who trumpet the importance of the liberation war care so little for the victims of that war. I know this. The Amani Trust was one of the first organizations ever looked at the victims of organized violence and torture from the liberation war. It's a scandal that a government that admits that terrible things happened in the 1980s focuses on every other consequence than the direct suffering of the victims and survivors. That's what's going on in respect of Burundi. We talk about IDs and birth certificates. We talk about all sorts of things, but we do not talk about truth, justice, and rehabilitation. It's a scandal that the government continuously allows organized violence to continue to take place during elections. It's a scandal that government puts the PVO bill. So therefore, what we have to bear in mind, as everybody said, it's not just assisting the victims and survivors of torture. We must not deal merely with the system damages and communities and all the issues. It means a fundamental change. I want to thank everybody who persists today. This has been rich, it's been long, it's been complicated, and it's been difficult to hear. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Aska. Thank you, Olivia. And thank you all for listening. I'd like to hand this back to Ibo. Thank you, Ibo.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tony and the team. The session, a very interesting session on helping the victims and survivors of organized violence and torture in Zimbabwe. Very interesting report and very engaging. We even went beyond normal time. We thought we would end earlier, but so intense and so interesting was the discussion that we all glued to it. And thank everybody who has joined us on this. And before I again thank Tony and the team, is just to remind you that next week we are looking at a book by Godfrey Kanyenze, Leaving So Many Behind, the link between politics and the economy in Zimbabwe. The book is being launched. We hope to carry it virtual as well next Thursday, the 3rd. And on the 10th, we have another session on the elections, understanding the 2018 Zimbabwe elections, the technical manipulation of elections, phase 2. So that's forthcoming. And thank you. Keep in touch. And good night.
Africa, khona